Welcome back. In this episode, we're going to have a look at how we can move objects around in our 3D worlds and what tools and helper functions are available inside DAZ Studio to make that the most efficient process it could possibly be. So this is another one of those things that needs to become second nature really to you, because it is something we're going to be doing a lot, whether it is moving figures into positions on a set, whether it is moving cars around in a larger level, or sorting books on a bookshelf, or putting dirt on the road, or putting food on the table. All these things, we're not going to be dealing with sets so much, but it is important to adjust things like earrings on ears, or giving glasses the proper position on a figure's face, and so forth. So we need to know about these. And let's delve in with my favorite tool, which is in fact called the Universal Manipulator tool. It's this one at the top left here. You can also get it from the menu under Tools, Universal. Here it is. And it's a combination of the rotation, the translation, and the scale tool. So the rotate, scale, and translate tools, they're essentially three separate tools, and the Universal Manipulator brings them all together. And it does this by giving us this little gizmo at the bottom here. If we demonstrate this with the cube, it has literally all the McGubbins. Can we see that? Yeah, we can just about see it. Maybe that cube would be better if it's got a different color here. Just make that gray again. Sorry about that, buddy. You looked so nice in color. But I'm going to go and explain this because we can see that the top axis is green and the left one is blue, and kind of the left one is red. Left, right one is red, and the front, back one is blue. And it corresponds to the colors that we see in this cube here. So top, bottom is in fact green, and then front, back is blue, and then left, right is red. So the Universal Manipulator, because it has all these tools combined, it has the arrows, which if you go and left click and drag on any of them, you move these objects around in any of the directions. So as I said, bring in a couple of primitives and just go practice this for a bit, because this is what you're going to be doing a lot. It'll work exactly the same as the translate tool, which is this little guy here. So if I click him, then I have all these other functions removed and just the arrows are available. These triangles here, they're quite nice to see. They're also available on the Universal Manipulator. They will let you move an object in two axes at once. So if I wanted to move my cube left and up, then I can go and hover over this little triangle here, left click and drag, and that'll move my cube up and down and left and right, in essentially locked in this one plane. So what I'm not doing is moving it back and forth. I can't do that, but I can move it not just one axis, but two axes at the same time. So that's kind of handy to have this skill, and it works in any of the directions. So I can also use it on the bottom plane here. Sometimes it's a little hard to see, so when you hover you get this better indication here. So this cube isn't going up or down, but it will go left and right and front and back now. So that's quite nice. I can also rotate my objects. That's with these half circles here, these little indications. When I hover over it, then I can see the full circle around the axis around which I'm going to rotate this. So this would now rotate this around my Z-axis, which is the blue one. Or I can rotate around the Y-axis, which is the green one here. Hover, left click and drag, and then that happens. Or I can do it on the X-axis, which is then this one here. Hover, left click and drag, and it'll do this. That's quite nice. So that's how we can move and rotate objects around. The last tool I want to show you is the scale tool, and that's the little boxes here. So there's the white one in the center, which when left clicked and dragged will increase all three axes at the same time. So that will leave the dimensions of the objects intact. It just makes it bigger or smaller. Control Z always undoes that. There's also the little cubes on either axis, and that'll go and stretch the cube, or my object in fact, along that one axis. So if you wanted to build a steel beam or something, you can do that in any of the directions, or you can go and make it really flat. That's also possible. So if you do this, then it's like it becomes a really a flat tabletop, and then you can use this to make it larger again, and then you can literally just go and stick 4 other cubes onto the bottom, and then that makes it in fact a table. It's kind of nice, isn't it? Yeah, so very powerful, these things. But they're also, at the same time, they're also a little bit vague. So even though we can do it, I'm thinking, well, What if I wanted my cube to be exactly twice the size that it is as it is right now? I mean, is that twice the size? Is it this? Is it this? I can't really tell. So it would be nice to have numeric values in addition to this, and thankfully we have that. And sometimes it's easier to adjust numeric values than it is to use sliders, so it really depends on the situation. Let me go and head over to the parameters tab here, and in the general section we have a section called transforms, and that is in fact what that is. We've been dealing with transforms. We've been transforming objects. If I click on that, I have all the options available, but if that's a bit too much for me and I want to whittle this down, I can open this up and then just head to translation, and then I can only see the X, Y, and Z axis of my object. And these are now either numeric values that I can type in here, or I can go and use the slider to do the same thing. So if I wanted to move my cube along this axis here, along the X axis, when I move it, I can see that the numeric value updates at the top left there. Control Z undoes that, and it works the other way around as well. If I go and just left click and drag the slider, then my cube moves as a result. And that's kind of nice because it lets me make really small adjustments, especially if I needed to line up two objects. Then this is often the better choice than doing it with the manipulator. So what I often do is I rough it out with the manipulator, put two things into the position that they need to be, and then I make really small adjustments with these manipulator, either with these dials or with literally the values. By the way, if you wanted to reset any of these values to the default's always gray here, and all the sliders in DAZ Studio work the same. So no matter if it's a morph slider for a figure or anything else, anything that's white is a value that has changed from the default, and anything that's kind of dark gray, that's a value like 0 here. If I type in 0, hit enter, then this goes to 0. That was the default value, and that's kind of gray here. If I wanted to bring this back and I don't know what the default value was, you can alt click any of these sliders and then that will bring the default value back. So in my cube, that was the 0 basically on all axes. So if I alt click on the slider now, it goes and brings the 0 back here. You know, I just realized I've forgotten to tell you something in the previous part. I do apologize. What are the keyboard shortcuts for viewport navigation? As you can see, I don't actually use these things to orbit around an object. I use the keyboard shortcuts. I'm so sorry I forgot. It's Control Alt left click and drag in the viewport that will do that. That will orbit around something. And Control Alt right click in the viewport will pan. Yeah, I totally forgot about that. So I use this all the time. And these can also be overridden if you have a different favorite viewport navigation shortcut like Alt left click. You can set that up in Window, Workspace, Customize here. And then this window pops up at the very bottom of which you see the viewport shortcuts here. Can we see that? Yes. It's mouse button modifiers for orbit, rotate, pan, dolly, bank, and so forth. You can set them all up individually. So if I wanted to have this instead of Control Alt left mouse button, if I wanted to have this Alt left mouse button, I would double click into this field here until it says enter new shortcut. And then I'd go and say Alt left click, and then it knows it's Alt left mouse button now. If I'd apply and accept now, then that's going to be locked in. I'm going to go and undo that, double click, Control Alt and left click. New modifier conflicts with the viewport action. Do you wish to continue? Well, it's the one that's already there. So I suppose I could have just hit cancel. I'm going to go and continue. I'm not going to override anything. It's okay. That's where that is. Just as an aside here, I totally forgot to mention that. There we go. I'll hit cancel to get out of this. Sometimes we need to line two objects up with one another. Like if I bring my sphere back and I wanted to put my sphere on top of my cube, I can go and do that. It's kind of far away here. So if I want to bring this forward, I can just use the translate button or the translate dial and just left click and drag on it and then bring it forward a little bit so that it's somewhere within my vicinity. Or you can select both objects, not from the viewport, by the way, but from the scene tab. So first object, shift select the second object and hit Control F, then we'll see both of them next to one another. So if I wanted to put my sphere on top of my cube, I could go and select that, use this little triangular thing to bring it into kind of this position here, and then I might go and move it up a little bit and then go and move it over here, and it's kind of there-ish. But when I move my viewport, I can see, hey, from here it kind of looked like it was right on top of it. But from the other side, it looks like, hey, I've misjudged this completely. And this can happen in 3D quite frequently, as I said, because we're looking at an approximation of the 2D window onto our 3D world. And hence, we're not really getting the full picture here. So one way is, of course, to rotate around and then go, okay, fine, I'm going to go move this guy further over here. But then if I do this, well, is my sphere really on top of the cube? No, actually, there's a bit of a gap here, and I didn't quite see that either. So those are things that can be adjusted with different ways of looking at your 3D world, namely by using orthographic viewports. So orthographic viewports are the ones that do not draw perspective. Like I said before, this foreshortening thing that we see in the grid, that this front line here is longer than this one on the back, even though when we look from the top, they are all square. So technically they should have the same length. But if I look at it from an angle, I can see that this one's definitely shorter than that one. And that's just because the perspective is drawn with this foreshortening technique. Orthographic viewports don't draw that, and we get to view our objects directly from the side. So almost like this, but even though if I were to try really hard, I can still see that there's some perspective being drawn, even though I'm trying to kind of frame it out. But DAZ Studio has specific viewports for that, and they can be accessed up here where it says perspective view. If you click on that, then you have these drop downs here, and it lets you look at the front view, the left view, right view, back view, top view, and the bottom view. So if we go from the front, for example, then we see no perspective now. And it also looks like none of my viewport controls here work except for the pan. So pan and dolly, that'll still work, but nothing that has anything to do with perspective will work. And this now lets me adjust the exact position from the side. And this would now probably go and touch my cube here. It's directly on top of the cube now. Sometimes, so then you can go switch back to the perspective view and say, yeah, that's kind of nice. But this view wouldn't have let us line up the exact position of the sphere from the left. So for that, we'd have to go into the left view and then see, is my sphere actually in the middle? And perhaps it isn't. Maybe it needs to be kind of, adjusted left, right, and so forth. So if I do this now and then go back into my front view, then this appears to be right in the center. But if I go and look from another direction, I can see that that's not the case. Like from the top, for example, that gives it away, hey, that isn't the case. So there we go. Sometimes for that reason, and this is kind of why I'm bringing it up, not only are these orthographic views really nice helper tools to let us adjust things, sometimes it's actually helpful to see them side by side to our perspective view so that we can line things up properly. Other times it might be nice to have both our camera in view as well as our perspective view that we use to line things up with. So like camera, we're going to learn more about this later, but if I were to frame this object up now, and I say create new camera from this, and I copy the active viewport and hit accept, then I get a camera object in my scene to which I can now switch. So that is exactly the same shot. But the good thing is if I go back to my perspective view and move around and wanted to look at something else and make adjustments now, I have the shot still lined up. So if I go and switch back to camera, this is not touched. So if I've got my perfect framing there, creating a camera is a way to lock that in. Just as an aside, that we're going to speak more about this later. But sometimes I'd like to see maybe my camera as well as the perspective view, or I'd like to see an orthographic view and my perspective view, maybe like, multiple viewports at the same time. And we can do that, and many 3D artists in fact use this. Let me go and close this down so I give myself a little bit more room here. I can split my viewport into different layouts, and that happens over here under Window, Viewports. And I've got this one currently that means the whole viewport is a single view, but a side-by-side view would mean that I have two, or top and bottom one means I also have two, they're just differently arranged. Let's just try out the side-by-side here and see what happens. So I do this and it looks like I'm getting two independent viewports. Look at that. This could be the perspective view, and this one here, it's automatically picked the front view, but it could be something else. I could use the top view, or I could use maybe even my camera view. It even has a different draw style. So we'll learn more about draw styles later, but the color in this one looks a little bit different than in this one. And that's because the filament draw option isn't selected in here. It's selected the texture shaded viewport. So this is why it's really handy to have multiple viewports. I could have the iRay preview in here and not have it on in here, for example. So you can completely independently configure them from one another. This one's got the aspect ratio, this one doesn't. So you can, once again, the hamburger icon will help you out here. But there's also ways that lets you display more than 2 viewports at the time. So viewports, maybe we'll use the 4 views like this. That is also possible. Notice that when you do that and you move your object around, not all viewports will catch up at the same time. So if I go and make them all the perspective view just in different draw options, and I were to move this around, your computer basically has to work 4 times as hard now, because it will render the same scene 4 times. So even if it's from different directions and different angles here. But yeah, typically you'd have a perspective view here, and then you might have a left view in here, and then you might have a top view in here, and then you might have a front view in here. And that means while you're adjusting an object, like this one, for example, you can see what that does in all viewports at the same time. Or if you wanted to do it with the perspective view versus the camera, you can see what your camera does, maybe with the iRay viewport enabled while you're adjusting lights or something like that. So it's a very handy technique, and I encourage you to explore it. My favorites are the top and bottom. I often use that I have the camera in the top here, and then the perspective view in the bottom. You can also move these around. So if you wanted one a bit smaller and the other one a bit bigger, you can do that. That also works on the 4 viewports. Another favorite configuration is literally this one here, that you have 2 or 3 on the side and 1 large one on the other side. So that is another configuration you may have seen in other professional 3D applications, that some artists like working that way. So I tend to switch it around depending on what the situation requires. There we go. My sphere isn't quite directly on top of this, so this kind of makes it very easy to. It basically just shows me what needs to be done in which viewport, so that my objects are aligned properly. That's what I'm trying to say. So that's the reason why multiple viewports make sense sometimes. Speaking of lining things up, there's one other thing I'd like to bring to your attention, and I'm going to go back to my single view for that. And that is a snapping option that DAZ Studio has. Not many people know about this actually, but if you were to, if we go to our cube down here, and while we're at it, I will make it a different color again. Now that we've seen the manipulator, I'm going to go make it kind of bluish again. There we go. So right now I can go, and maybe I'll just go and make my sphere invisible, that we're just focusing on the cube here. If I go and left click and drag, it looks like my cube can literally go anywhere, and that's backed up by the values here. No matter what I do, there's some kind of float value that'll appear here, unless I do something that resets it back to 0. But I can make it happen that the cube only snaps into position at certain points, and that happens under a tab that we haven't actually opened yet, and it's a very important one, and I'm going to go and do this now, either with right clicking it on the bottom here and then choosing tool settings, or you can also just go to window panes and then pick it from here. And the tool settings, that's an important one, because any of these things up here, they're all technically tools, and each tool has different options, and it's kind of important that we know about where we can look at the options, change the options, and make amendments there. So one of them on the Universal Manipulator, that's different from this one here, from the rotational one, or from the translate, or from the scale. They all have different tool options here. They all look very similar, but as I said, the universal one brings it all together. So here we have an option that says snapping, and we can use it for translate, rotate, or scale independently. So if I use it for scale, just as an example, if I enable that, it has a value down here that says 10%. So I can't scale my cube for any value, it'll snap into 10% increments. So watch what happens when I try and do that. Left click and drag this little white cube here, and you can see that it's no longer doing it kind of fluidly, it snaps into place, and that's kind of cool. If we go and look at the parameters tab on the scaling tab, I can see that that is in fact what happens. So I get to see 150, 170, 180, so it snaps into these places here. I'm going to go bring this back to 0, go back to tool settings, and go and change this to something maybe like, let's leave the scale, let's go to the translate and go and do the same thing. So I can go and this is kind of interesting. It gives you a preview of where it lets me go. So if I go and left click on my X translate, I get to see these little ridges here, and that is where the cube will be able to snap into place. So if you ever needed to copy things and line things up with one another, as long as you know the size of what you're doing there, this is going to be really handy. It also works for the 2-axis, in which case it gives you a grid, which looks kind of funky. As I said, not many people know about this. So it's nice when you're level building things. If you have something like a modular kit and you have walls that are exactly 120 centimeters in width, you could tell the translation snapping to be exactly 120 centimeters. And then if you drag the walls into place, they will all be seamless and you don't have to eyeball them. That's kind of nice. And the same works for rotation as well. If I go and switch translation snapping off and go with rotation snapping, then we have this. We also get these little ridges displayed on the manipulator here. There we go, that's snapping. And one other thing that I find very cool is that you can configure these independently per tool. So if you were to say, I'd like my Universal Manipulator to not employ snapping, but if I go and switch over to my rotational tool, then I'd like it to be able to snap in 15-degree increments. That is possible. So this is now just the rotational, that'll snap. But if I go back to my universal one, it being independently configured, it does not snap. So that's quite nice. If you're building levels a lot, or if you're lining things up a lot, this might make your life a lot easier. On this final note, there's another tab that you might want to look into if you're lining lots of objects up with one another. I'm not going to go into it here, just so that you know it exists. It's the Align tab, and it lets you essentially select a bunch of objects and let them align along one axis. So, just know that it's there. There's more to be done in regards to aligning, but I think we've pretty much covered everything that I wanted you to know about this. We've got the multiple viewports, we've got how to move objects, we've got the different ways in which we can look at objects through perspective views or orthographic views, and we've delved into snapping. I think that's pretty much all that I wanted to show you here. In the next episode, I'm going to look into how we can navigate larger sets. So what we've discussed so far worked well for small objects and characters and the stuff that we're going to be discussing most in this course. But if you do work with larger sets as well, then the next video is going to come in handy. Stay tuned for that.